this next segment we're going to do, it's still in this whole overarching theme of preparing and setting up that we've been covering. And I want to talk about preparations for different situations. So setting up your first aid kit for different kinds of events. I want to start off by saying that as you're setting up your first aid, as you're setting up for different first aid situations, you just want to really take into account what potential things you're going to run into. So for instance, if you're going to a friend's party, you might think of herbs for hangovers if you're going to spend the night there. If your children play sports, let's say hockey, and your daughter is the goalie, you might start thinking herbs to help with soft tissue injuries or other things that might happen in hockey. If you're a handy person and you're always fixing stuff, then all the kinds of bangs and scrapes that you get. So the point is, when you're preparing a first aid kit, there is an idea of a general theme for different places, but really the question is, what are the most likely events that you're going to come into when you to prepare your first aid bag for? So there's the events that you're going to come into, like once again, let's say your children play sports a lot, and if you're playing soccer, like one potential thing is just twisting your ankle. So what kind of materials would you have for a twisted ankle? Cold packs, ace bandages, arnica tincture, echinacea tincture. So those kinds of things. The second thing is, whatever first aid bag you prepare should always be prepared for yourself. So all of us have our own fatal flaws. There is the place in us that when things go wrong, we get sick, whether it's in our lungs, our skeletal muscle system, our nervous system. So you should always have a first aid kit that is especially prepared for you, or if you always travel with somebody, for them, that has the medicines that are necessary for your personal health and comfort. So I hope that makes sense, but always, whenever you go do anything, if you're going to go to a street medic protest and help out there, if you're going to a rainbow gathering, if you're going to travel overseas, the primary medicine that you need is whatever it is for you that tends to go wrong, and make sure you stock plenty of that or know how to get that in other places. So the situations I want to cover here, all of them in somewhat brief, we'll talk about specific herbs later, is a home first aid kit, a car travel first aid kit, a non-car traveling first aid kit, whether you're riding the rails or planing overseas, backpacking, and then large events or gatherings. So those are the situations that I'm going to cover. To say them again, it's traveling at your home, traveling by car, traveling without a car, backpacking, and large gatherings. Oh, and the final one is also street medic situations. So I'll talk about what that even means later. So the first is your home. Your home medicine kit is your largest medicine kit because there's nothing to stop you except the size of your home. So when you're thinking about what you're going to have at home, you can think about everybody you know. You can think about your friends and your family and people who potentially visit you, because you're only limited by the size of your home and what medicines you can afford to make. So the home first aid kit is the most extensive first aid kit that can cover the most amount of materials, because also you'll probably have a stove where you can easily make teas. And so it's a very non-specific kind of first aid kit. It's also good, by the way, to just have a kit, like just have something that has bandages and all that in one place so you don't have to scrounge around your whole home. And then, once again, whatever situations you see the most, whatever kind of injuries a person has, if you're gardening a lot, maybe something for knees that you're always on all the time and just getting creaky, whatever the situations are personally and for those around you. The next kind is a car travel kit. So by car travel, I mean you're going around the country, let's say, or you're going anywhere, but you're going to be in your car. Your car travel kit can also be pretty extensively, much smaller than a home kit, but it could also be pretty full size because, hopefully you have some room in the trunk, or some other area to store it. Your car travel kit is going to be geared mostly for yourself and others in your car. Because it can be bigger, though, you can also think about what are the common first aid situations that you come up against. Or if you're visiting people and you know that they like certain medicines, you can bring them as well. But we've narrowed it. Like the home is anybody who comes into contact with you. Your car is yourself, people in the car, and maybe people you're visiting, and then just common events that you might see. Generally, the difference in, and a word I haven't covered yet is the word backstock. So at home, you have a lot of backstock. Basically, you'll have bottles of medicine, and then you have the backstock in case you need to refill those bottles of medicine. So in the car, generally you can have a pretty good sized kit, but you probably don't have any backstock to refill those bottles after they run out. The next one is going to be the non-car travel. So this is for you crusties riding the rails, or folks hitchhiking, or actually taking planes and traveling around places. It's going to be a fairly light first aid kit because you're going to be carrying it on you. It's going to be in a backpack or a side bag, but basically you don't have a place to store it. You're going to have it on you. Primarily, it's going to have personal medicines. So your non-car travel kit has those things that you need the most. If you get sick a lot, you might have a bunch of echinacea. If you know you sprain your limbs a lot, you might have some arnica oil and some ace bandages. It's going to be lightweight, only those medicines that are necessary. It's going to have probably medicines, and this is an important part that's going to come into all of the smaller bags and even some of the larger first aid kits. What you want in these medicine kits that you want as light as possible are medicines that cover a few bases. So things like lobelia, which do a few things well, might be something to carry with you. Or activated charcoal, which does a few things well. I'll cover into specific medicines later, but what's really helpful in these light ones is 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things that do more than one thing, unless it's a personal medicine, like you know that you need anemone for panic attacks. So anemone is a good panic attack herb, as we'll cover. And you get panic attacks, and anemone only helps there, but it's so specific for you that it's still very worthwhile carrying with you. The other thing, so what I just said is that medicines that have dual purposes. The second part of that is medicines in which small amounts go a long way. So for instance, echinacea is not one of those. It's one of the reasons I don't recommend echinacea for small kits. It's very helpful. Echinacea can stimulate both adaptive and innate immunity, but generally, in the way I use it, you need an ounce a day or something for specific kinds of health issues. So you just need more of it, which means more weight, right? Because that's really the problem, is weight and how much space it takes up. Weight and how much space it takes up. So some plants, though, like lobelia once again, or activated charcoal, or even chaparral, a small amount goes a long way. And so it's useful to bring them. They might cover a few more than one base, and you don't need as much. So medicines that cover a few issues, medicines that small amounts go a long way. When you're traveling, you want to consider, so when you're preparing your first aid kit for non-car travel, you want to think of where are you going and what are the health conditions. So let's say you're going to Guatemala, and you're going by bus or by air, and you're going to Guatemala, and you can't, you're going to be backpacking it the whole way. You want to know, like, what are the possible problems that you personally might run into Guatemala? Some things that are considerably new infectious material, bacteria. And the most common problem for people coming from more sanitized countries, like the United States, is all the stuff in the food and water. So part of it is like your personal health issues that you might have all the time, and then it's like, where am I going and what am I going to run into? And if you know you're going to Guatemala, and whenever you go to Guatemala you get diarrhea, then you would want to bring the medicines for diarrhea there too. So health conditions you have, health conditions that you might acquire where you're going. The next part of this is, are there medicines that you know you can gather or purchase where you're going? So like in your home, it's already there. In your car, you can have lots of stuff. Now all of a sudden you're going to Guatemala and you're like, well, I know I get diarrhea. Do they have activated charcoal or other kinds of charcoal in Guatemala? Are there medicines that I know work for my diarrhea when I get there? So one thing to consider to make your pack lighter, if you're going directly some places, can you gather? So I'm going to the Rocky Mountains, and you're going to the Rocky Mountains, and you know that you have high altitude sickness in the Rockies, and you're going to 9,000 feet, but you also know that you're going near some big Osha patches, and Osha Ligusticum porteri can help with high altitude sickness. So you don't need to carry Osha with you if you're going someplace that has that plant and you know that you can gather it. You have to know you can gather it, otherwise you're going to get there, you're going to get sick, there's no place to find it. So in general, in non-car travel, the categories that I would consider are personal health issues, infections, cuts and wounds, and digestive disorders, including diarrhea. So if you're traveling, those are some of the most common things. You might also put in sprains and strains. The most common things you see, though, are personal health issues, whatever goes wrong with you, infections, cuts, scrapes, and wounds, and digestive problems. If you know, for instance, you also get panic attacks, then you would bring anemone or those medicines with you. I want to cover a few of the plants that I'm suggesting, a few of the medicines that I am suggesting if you travel and you're backpacking it, that are lightweight and cover a few different situations. Later on, I'm going to do materia medica on these. When I say materia medica, I mean the materials used in medicine. And the materials used in medicine for herbalists are primarily plants and then some other substances as well. So the materia medica for non-car travel, meaning backpacking generally, is activated charcoal, because activated charcoal covers a few bases and is lightweight. Propolis tincture, once again later on I'll cover these in more in depth, but propolis tincture covers a few things also well and small and lasts a long time. I would also carry some berberine containing herbs. Some berberine herbs that have berberine, two of the most famous ones are Oregon grapefruit and Goldenseal. So instead of saying Oregon grapefruit or Goldenseal, or golden grapefruit or Oregon seal, is plants that are rich in berberine, such as yellow root and gold thread, and these plants can be really helpful. Berberine containing herbs in tincture form, so Goldenseal tincture, Oregon grapefruit tincture, barberry tincture, Berberis species, do cover a few bases, are strong, and can get you through some problems without needing as much. So berberine containing herbs, mostly tinctures. And those are the main ones that I would recommend. I try to keep traveling kits light. And then just your personal medicines. Personal medicines, by the way, cover conventional medicines. So if you have asthma and you use an albuterol inhaler, you should travel with that on you. If you know that you need certain sleep medicines and only they work, you should carry those with you and not expect to find them where you're going. So by personal medicines, I mean medicines that are herbal, but if you're type 2 diabetes, you might want your type 2 diabetes medicines with you too. It's important. You might not be able to find them where you're going. The next category is pretty similar, and that's backpacking. Backpacking, so I'm talking about hiking someplace and getting into the wilderness, or just getting away from people. This is generally your lightest first aid situation. But with backpacking, I would suggest if you can have a good digging tool, which could be a really strong knife and pruners, or you just get a knife that works really well that can act as pruners, meaning cutting plants, and a digging tool like a hori, you'll cover a lot of bases, because often if you're going into the wilderness, just any woods at all really, and if you know your plants, then you can make a lot of your own medicines. So I would suggest buying a really good knife for that. That way you don't have to have pruners or horis, but though they might come in handy as well. Once again, like I have a pretty shishi expensive knife. It's hard to tell, but I just want to point out not all knives are made equal. This is a Benchmade knife. And This knife, the company guarantees the knife, and my knife has broken. I've had it for like 9 or 10 years. I constantly use it. It's a knife that I really like very much, and they've fixed it when it broke, which is great. But the knife itself, the knife was a gift to me, but I think it cost about 125 bucks. 125 bucks. So it was given to me. I don't know if I'd ever spend that much. Now I would. And the things that make it good is it just doesn't break, and it doesn't close on your fingers. It has a special locking mechanism right there. So when it's locked in, it just can't unlock. And it's just made well. So you shouldn't dig with knives. You ruin the blade. You can break them. But this Benchmade knives, there's many companies that make great knives. But what I'm suggesting is don't get a crappy pocket knife that's just going to break and be more of a weight than anything else. Spend the money on a good knife, and then a good knife flicks open. It didn't get it the first time, didn't get it the second time. Always makes that very positive, reaffirming noise, and you can close it again. So it's not a switchblade, it just opens easy. The nice thing, by the way, of opening easy, besides the intimidation factor, is just that sometimes you actually need to one-hand your knife. So it's just a nice loose blade. Really what I'm saying here, besides I love my knife and I'm showing it off, is that I really suggest having a good knife because it covers a few bases. And that way when you're backpacking, you can gather some of your own medicines. So back to backpacking. So it's usually the least amount of medicines. Now we've talked about gathering your own. You're going to limit it to the most necessary, but you got to bring those medicines that are important for your health. You can't, you might not like taking drugs that are pain relievers because you're in chronic pain, but you're not going to hike for days on end and become less pain, likely more pain. So just consider what you need to reduce pain in these situations. So everything that I've said previously, like medicines that cover a few bases are important. Medicines that small amounts work are important. And in this case, having tools on you to gather your own medicine can be helpful. In backpacking, your most common problems are injuries. So falling or just walking all day, twisting your ankle, these kinds of things where now you're like 7 miles in and you walk someplace and your ankle got twisted a little bit and now it's all swollen. It's just really important to have something for that. We'll talk about specifics. Once again, cuts, bruises, and infections are common. And then your personal health issues. So I'm suggesting herbs that are useful for personal health with every backpack, with every first aid circumstance. Infections, cuts, bruises, and tissue injuries, like soft tissue injuries, sprained ankles. The medicines are pretty similar with 1 or 2 things added to it than from the non-car travel. So again, activated charcoal, in case you get some kind of internal. You can use activated charcoal, as we'll talk about later, internally and externally. A berberine-containing herb, if you can gather it, all the better. If you're in the Rocky Mountains, you can use the Berberis repens, the creeping barberry. Propolis, which covers a few bases. But the one thing that I would add in differently to a backpacking kit, 2 things. First, I would make sure that you have an ace bandage. Or we'll talk about vet wrap in a little while. Really helpful, and there's really no way to duplicate it with plants. I've tried, it freaking looks cool to wrap bandage, to pretend you can wrap a leaf, but really they just don't hold. So I would say if you're gonna go backpacking for a while, carry 1 bandage on you, 1 ace bandage, just made specifically for that. And also something for soft tissue injuries, something like an arnica, St. John's wort, salve or oil. Arnica, St. John's wort, salve or oil. You might also add anti-inflammatories like turmeric or yarrow into that. And if you add something like Goldenseal, you're increasing its potential to kill any kind of infectious organism. So primarily in a sense arnica, because that's one of the best anti-inflammatories that have happened recently for soft tissues. St. John's wort increases the efficiency of the arnica for that. Then an anti-inflammatory like turmeric or yarrow can even make it more anti-inflammatory. Yarrow has the capability also of helping kill infectious organisms. And then the last one, as I put it, is a Goldenseal or Oregon graperoot, some berberine containing or something that, like myrrh. Well, myrrh doesn't go into oil well. something else in that salve that will also help kill stuff, though it's not as important because you might have that in a separate form. So that's for backpacking. Soft tissue injuries, infections, cuts, wounds, and then whatever else goes wrong with you, digestive upsets, let's say. The next one is large gatherings. By large gatherings, it might be a large musical event. It might be a just very big party that somebody's giving for a few days. If it's less than a day, often you can really limit what you bring. After a few days is when you start to see people get sicker more often. And for me, also the rainbow gatherings are definitely a large event. 10,000 people for a week and a half counts a lot for large events. When you go into a larger event, meaning many people over a period of time, you have special considerations. The first is you have a lot wider diversity of healthcare issues. Whether it's indoors or outdoors, you know that you're going to have more problems coming up in these situations. The other thing is not only a diversity of healthcare issues, but you're also going to need a lot of backstock. So by backstock, I mean refill for your bottles. And the other thing that you need with backstock is that there's always the potential that stuff will get ripped off or broken. And so you have to figure out how to keep your backstock safe. At the rainbow gathering, that's tricky. Everything is intense, and so we just have to kind of guard the backstock and the front stock that people could gather. People can gather, not gathering, they're stealing. Or just wandering off with it. You give people a bottle and they wander off thinking that you gave it to them. So you have to figure out ways to safeguard your medicines. Now that's not always true. You're going to a party or you're having a party, you're going to a block party, you can have your stuff in your car and it's reasonably safe. But some of the events that I go to, actually one of the considerations, they said you might be bringing thousands of dollars worth of medicines. How do you protect your investment? Or if you go to a street medic, if you go to a protest we'll talk about, and you bring all this backstock, where do you keep it, right? Where do you keep it that it's safe? So in large events, you might have 3 different forms of your medicine. You might have the medicines that you carry on you for medicine. That's called your run bag. In just a few minutes, we'll look at the run bag. You might have backstock. You probably will have backstock. Otherwise, you can go through these little bottles fast. And you might also just have a separate bag for your personal medicines. If you're going to be away for a week in a place where you're around a lot of infectious disease and hurt people, you might just make sure that you have your own medicine bag to treat yourself that's separate. So in case things go missing, you still have medicines for yourself. When you're thinking about large events and treating at them, one of your basic questions is, do you have access to hospitals and ambulances, or do you not, right? If you have access, if you can quickly get an ambulance there, so you're at a block party, and the block party might go on for 5 days, and lots of people might get wasted and hurt themselves, but you also know that if you call the 911, that there's an ambulance there in 15 minutes. That's one set of situations. But if you're at a wilderness gathering, if you're at a rainbow gathering, if you're at one of these places where you're further away, you have to plan your medicines around the fact that you might not be able to get somebody to emergency care for a longer period of time. So when you're planning stuff out, one of your questions is, will you have access to hospitals and ambulances and medical personnel that surrounds that or not? Most of the times you do, by the way. And when I say access, I guess also third, if you're going to work, like I've worked in Nicaragua you also don't have access to a lot of different medicines, and so your medicines there's no ambulances. I mean, there's ambulances, not many. They're not easy to come by. So in the island that I worked in Nicaragua with Natural Doctors International, which is going to have herbalists. We'll talk about Natural Doctors International. But with that group, you also have to be prepared to treat people on the spot without access. But the difference is, for instance, in Nicaragua, it's just life as normal. It's not like all of a sudden you're in a situation like here. If we're doing wilderness situation and people get hurt, they're used to that kind of access to modern medicine. In Nicaragua, it's life as usual, which is not a lot of access for a lot of different health conditions. So it's a political thing in this. which takes me to something else about working in larger situations. And that is, will you be working alone or will you be working with other people? Now, generally, you're working with some people. This gets very tricky. If you're doing like street medic work means you go to a protest, like the Republican National Convention in New York City a few years ago, 1994, is that when you're in a situation like that, you might, you're helping treat people, and even though it's an urban environment where you might have some autonomy, you're probably also going to be in collusion working with other kinds of folks. And at the Rainbow Gathering, same thing. Or at the Free Clinic, working with other people around. When you're working with other people, you have to kind of figure out, will you work together or just side by side? They're very different ways of working. So working together means a few people see a patient and make decisions. So you have a medical doctor and an acupuncturist and an herbalist. And somebody has throbbing pain, and you have to decide who's going to treat it and what's the best avenue. Working together could be very tricky depending on who you're working with. Generally, if people are reasonably humble and well-skilled, often there's a sitting back and figuring out what's best for the patient. I've noticed, though, a lot of situations I've worked in, especially doing street medic work, is that nobody treats people often, and so they want to treat. They want to be the one to treat, which is often just an ugly scenario if you feel like people aren't doing that good a job. So in these situations, what I want to just point out is that you might be having, if you're the person who has more skills and just more knowledgeable about the whole scene, you might have to figure out how it works for people to work together and for you to work with other people. It might be a bit nebulous how I'm describing it, but I'm saying when you go someplace to help people, so you go to a music event, or you go to like the Women's Herbal Conference in California, or where there's a first aid station that has herbs, there'll probably be a few herbalists working, and how will you work together? Somebody comes in, who sees them, and how do you do it? In some situations, people are just very congenial and will work together. But other situations, it becomes headbutting. And so you just have to figure out what to do in those situations to help the patient best, which means good care and not create too much of a storm with your fellow workers. For me, it's a matter of trusting person's integrity and their competency. So integrity meaning that they're really out there for the patient and they understand their limits, and competency just means how well skilled they are. But that's not to say that I would definitely work with people who seem like they have good integrity and don't have as much skills, but they're willing to work with me to help raise their skill level. A lot of this, what you start to see from me, herbal medicine is a front for all these other things that often get undersaid when we talk about healthcare. We often talk about we just give herbs. Herbs is just the treatment. You have this whole other scenario and all these other people and all this incoming energy and all these possible scenarios. And so herbs are important, right? That's what we're finally going to put on that person's body or in their body. But actually, you don't just get to put stuff in people's bodies. You have to test the medicines potentially and make sure that they don't have problems with alcohol and work within the milieu of people around you. And these are all important parts. So of course, we'll talk about herbs eventually. But as somebody who does a lot of clinical work, I feel like the clinical end is where herbalists often are underskilled. And I'm talking to anybody out there that to learn to get your clinical skills up, not just your treatment skills, not just your herb skills, how to address patients, how to be somewhat like professional in the sense of you make people comfortable, not professional in the sense of you're collecting money for what you're doing. So I will stop that rant for now and move on to the next part, which gives me